So it's during this crisis where the Vikings are continually invading that the Anglo-Saxons really come to prominence. And we're just going to talk about two important Anglo-Saxons. The first is political, Alfred the Great, and the second is literary, the Venerable Bede, who's the first historian of this time period. So Alfred was very influential as a great king. He, as we'll see in a little bit, defeats the Vikings, and he doesn't just defeat the Vikings in Britain. He defeats them at sea, which is particularly amazing because that's like the Vikings' territory. Alfred is incredibly interested in education. He says he knows nothing worse than that a man would not know. And so he puts together the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which is the first historical record of written English. And it's very interesting that Alfred's initial thought about education was we need to start writing things. We need to have our history and our understanding of self written down. And so Bede is very important to this. Venerable, of course, just means revered, or in this case, sort of holy. And he's the father of English history, writing some of the earliest recorded histories of the English people. Included in that, the first instance of English poetry that we see written on the page. So again, a couple more things about Alfred the Great. This Anglo-Saxon Chronicle is a very important thing. It was commissioned to help people acquire some knowledge of themselves and their history. And we'll see this particular idea as very, very important to Anglo-Saxon history and to Anglo-Saxon literature as well. These stories and the histories that we'll be looking at are intended here to give a people their identity. And this establishes an English culture through an emphasis on literature and education. So with Bede, we're going to look at a couple ideas here around Anglo-Saxon poetry. And there are three main devices that we'll see as characteristic of Anglo-Saxon poetry. The first is alliteration, which I'm sure you've all interacted with before, repetition of successive beginning letters. The next two are very connected just to Anglo-Saxon poetry. And the first one is called the caesura. Am I caesura? I am so sure. It is caesura, which is a break or a pause in the middle of a poetic line. When we look at true versions of Anglo-Saxon poetry, these pauses will be very easy to see. When we read Beowulf in modern translation, these pauses will look like punctuation in the middle of a line, so a period in the middle of a line or a semicolon in the middle of a line. Our tendency in America, and then as well, I think in just modern English-speaking poetry, is to take our breath at the end of a line. But Anglo-Saxon poetry, the pause was in the middle of the line, which gave a very different kind of rhythm and feel to the poetry. Another important aspect of the Anglo-Saxon poetic mind is the kenning, which is a two-word metaphor. And we'll see this device be used as a way to provide some more flavor and some more imagination in the storytelling. So a good example of an early kenning would be the phrase water road, which is an exchange for the word ocean. You'll see how that gives us different images to think of. It's kind of two pictures put together in our mind that combined create the thing that the poet is speaking about. There's a sense here of something that's almost like a riddle. You kind of have to figure out the metaphor. It's not readily apparent to you in the text. And that gives you this kind of playful device in language that lets us say things in a more colorful and more interesting way. So this is this is called Cadmon's Hymn. Now, the story of Cadmon is that he was a seated guest at a Christmas celebration, and at this particular table, everyone was asked to go around and sing a song or perform a memorized poem for everyone in the crowd. Now, this is like your nightmare on steroids, that a class would be asked to go around and read out loud or recite something from memory. And so Cadmon does what many of us would do. It's essentially, he raises his hand and asks to go to the bathroom. And so he excuses himself to the stables, and in the stables, he falls asleep. And during his sleep, an angel comes to him and says to him, Cadmon, let's hear your song. You're not going to get off so easy. I want to hear your song. And Cadmon says, I can't sing. That's why I left this thing in the first place. And the angel says, try again. And Cadmon, all of a sudden now, inspired by this angelic being, proceeds to give the first poem in the English language. Now, when you're looking at this poem, you're like, this is not the English language. And in many ways, you're correct. This is Old English. So I know a lot of us say Shakespeare is in Old English, but he's not. Shakespeare is in modern English. This that you're looking at right now is Old English. And you can recognize some of the letters, right? There's an N, an H, and an E, but these words themselves are not words that we're familiar with. However, as we're looking at this, we can recognize already some of the ideas of the poetic devices that we just looked at. First of all, every single one of these lines is split down the middle, and that, as you'll remember, is called the caesura. Secondly, you see a lot of alliteration here, and the alliteration in Anglo-Saxon poetry is across the line. So here's an H and here's an H, there's an M, and then across the line there's an M, there's a P, and across the line there's a P, etc., etc. A good look for a kenning is anywhere that you see a hyphen, right? So I'm going to play for you a version of this poem in actual Old English, and then we'll look at a modernized version of it and talk about some of the devices that we see there.